Well, debate has started on vehicle emissions standards, all designed to get more electric vehicles in Australia, but there are pretty severe roadblocks limiting their use in Australia. It includes the cost for petrol stations to install electric vehicle chargers and the national standards for these plugs just for one roadblock. Joining me live is Independent MP Zoe Daniels. Zoe Daniels, thanks so much for your time. You're at that conference there in Canberra. We've just heard from Robin Denholm and Mike Cannon-Brooks. They know a thing or two in this area. What have they said this morning? Anything pique your interest?
Well, I think what they've said, Laura, is that we need to get on with it. I think if there is a pervasive emotion in this packed room here this morning, it is frustration from those who have worked in the industry and have been working towards better emission standards, but also higher take-up of EVs for many years, and have felt actively roadblocked for the last decade on that. So there's a sense of get on with it. There are obviously blockages in the system. Supply is one. The emission standards is something that is fostering the import of inefficient vehicles into Australia. The cost of EVs is an issue, and the availability of chargers, as you mentioned. So there's lots of work to do, but the thing is that we've committed to hitting net zero by 2050. Part of that process is that all new vehicle sales need to be zero emissions by 2035 at latest. So there is no waiting on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. Chris Bowen is being notably cautious, I would say. You understand how politically sensitive this is. Of course, we know the coalition didn't win the election, but there are still costs. And for the average household, the cost of an electric vehicle is still too expensive. Yeah,
absolutely. It's too expensive for most people. But that said, surveys show that actually it's lower and middle income people who are more likely to want to buy an EV than high income people. So I think those people on lower and middle incomes recognise that if they can get an EV, if it's a cheaper EV that comes into the market over time as we open this up, or a second-hand one, that obviously reduces their cost. I mean, the cost of fuel we know is sky high. Wouldn't it be lovely if those people who are under that pressure don't have to go to the petrol station to fill their tank up with petrol at the cost of a couple of $100s a week or more in some cases if you're using your car for work? I mean, if we'd done this in 2016, it would have saved Australian consumers $5.9 billion in fuel costs, as well as saving us something like 9 million tonnes in CO2 emissions. So yes, there's a process and a transition to take place, but in the end it will be better for everyone.
Yeah, well, how do you see that happening? I mean, there is a short-term cost. Do you accept that?
Well, there is and there isn't. I mean, Australia has very low take-up of EVs. So one problem that we have is the limited number of electric vehicles that are coming into the market, the fact that the tax regime is such that they've been subject to things like fringe benefits tax, which the government has now moved on, for example. So part of the point is to bring EVs into the market to encourage those manufacturers that are currently sending internal combustion vehicles in to send EVs in at the lower and middle end of the market. So that's one piece of this. And then that enables people to potentially access electric vehicles. But the other factor, Laura, is the fuel efficiency element. Australians are currently paying something like 30% more for fuel than they should be compared to other countries in a similar sort of economic position. So if we bring more efficient fuel in, fuel costs should drop, and also people can drive further on more efficient fuel. So that helps those households as well. But I'm acutely aware that the low and middle income households in Australia should have access to these electric vehicles, and that includes renters who should have access to charging infrastructure.
I mean, there is an upfront cost to all of this. I keep on coming back to cost. I think we'll get there eventually, but it's who pays for it in the meantime. Whether it's a household paying it directly or taxpayers, it is more expensive to go down this path.
Well, there are models. So New Zealand has implemented recently a fee-based system whereby if you buy a traditional car with a traditional engine, you pay an amount on that, which then goes into subsidising those who are buying low emission or zero emission vehicles. In doing that, New Zealand has pushed its take-up of EVs up from something like 3 or 4% to 10% in a year. So that's the kind of model that we could look at, and that's cost neutral. So that's something that I will be looking at very closely ahead of these submissions that the Minister's asking people to put in as part of a discussion paper that he'll be launching next month.
One of the more uncomfortable aspects, perhaps, of this debate down the track is going to be government revenue as well. The government obviously gets a lot of revenue out of the fuel excise, but could you see, or do you want to see that change? Would you support a road user charge?
Well, we're going to have to look at all these revenue sources, I think, over time. I mean, we're in a changing and evolving economy where revenue has been raised in particular ways. As you see the evolution of the kinds of vehicles that people are using, then you're going to have to figure out, well, where does the revenue come from differently, for example. So, yes, that's part of the process, and I expect that will also come up as part of the discussion paper that the Minister is pulling together. And I really hope that we don't take too much time with that. I understand, as you said, Chris Bowen is trying to be very cautious and putting forward a position of genuine consultation, which is good, but also we do need to get on with it. So let's get the consultation done, get the expert analysis and advice and move forward.
Before I let you go, what's happening with the Jobs Summit? Did you end up getting a Guernsey to that one?
I will be at the Jobs Summit, Laura. The government allocated 3 seats to the crossbench, and that's across the Senate and the House. So we had quite an expansive meeting of all the crossbenchers the other day to figure out who's going to be there when, and we have split it up so that those who want to be there and feel that they can have input that is of use will be able to be there for portions of the summit.
Okay, Zoe Daniel, we'll talk to you soon.